I've unintentionally picked my books as if they were going to be part of a wedding theme. I have something old, something new, something borrowed, and I got something blue just to make it fit. Anyway, I'm going to talk to you today about the 3 books that I've recently read, except it's not all going to be today. This isn't going to be quite a vlog, but I've decided that I want to start talking about the books closer to the time that I finish them, so there'll probably be some wardrobe changes as I talk about these books on different days, because obviously I'm not finishing them all on the same day. But since I know what 3 books I'm going to be talking to you about in this video, I'll go ahead and share those with you from the very start. For something old, I have my TBR vet, which is The Secret History. This is one of the books that's been on my shelves the longest that I still want to read. For something new, I have a book that I purchased just this year. I think it's also the book that I own that's most recently been published, and that is The Republic of Memory. For something borrowed, I have Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, and you might be wondering, how is this borrowed? No, this is not a library book, but I'm listening to this 100% on audiobook, and I am borrowing the audiobook from my local library. So let's go ahead and I will tell you about the first book that I read. The Secret History is published by Donna Tartt. It was published originally in 1992, and it is a suspense, mystery, literary, almost thriller. Dark academia is the term that I hear most frequently referring to this book. And this tells a story of Richard, who is a discontent youth growing up in California. He is really not enjoying family life, and his parents expect him to basically take over the family business. Richard has no plans to do that, and so as he goes off to college, he plans to stay away as much as possible and eventually ends up transferring to the other side of the United States to a small school in Vermont. When Richard arrives at the school, he decides that he wants to continue studying Greek and begin studying more of the classics, and that leads him to getting involved in a very niche group of students who work alongside one classics professor to take all of their classes and learn all of the things about Greek mythology, and it's just basically a classical education as far as the Western canon is concerned. But the more that Richard hangs out with these students, the more he realizes not everything's as it seems, as they don't seem to be sharing everything about themselves and what's going on. But he kind of understands that because he's also not really sharing all of his history with them, and things just kind of go on and escalate from there. This book is told in the first person from Richard's point of view. It starts at the end, so after all the drama of the book is over, and what seems like quite a bit later in Richard's life, and he is recounting in his own words basically the only story he's ever now able to tell, because this time period that he spends at this college with this group of students ends up being, I don't know how much a formative time, but one of the most important and memorable times in his life. He tells the story as kind of a series of vignettes over a couple of different parts of the book, and basically he's covering his time, how he became involved in this inner circle, how he kind of got to know these other students that were involved in it, and the tragedy that kind of ended up defining this time for him in college. This book is about a lot of things, and I have to admit I'm enjoying thinking about it more than I enjoyed reading it, but I'll get to that in a second. In terms of what I would say are the ideas that this book talks about, yes, it's in an academic setting, but I don't think it's so much about the academics that they're learning. It is more about the sublime or beauty as they talk about it. It's about aesthetics. It's about seeing things how you would like to see them and only noticing the things in life that are really bringing you joy or pleasure, I think is probably even a better word, and seeking that and seeking the feeling of being alive at all costs. In fact, there is a quote that Richard says at the very beginning of the book where he talks about his experience there, and he talks about whether or not there is such a thing as a fatal flaw, which is a idea from Aristotle, I believe, in his Poetics. And it's this idea that in literature, or for Aristotle, it would be in tragedies, that a good story is one where a character has a fatal flaw, some sort of weakness that prevents them from being the best version of themselves. And Richard shares with us, the reader, that he thinks his is a morbid longing for the picturesque at all cost. And I think that line actually describes all the students that he ends up hanging out with. I mentioned that Richard becomes involved in like a class group. There is just a small group of students that he studies the classics with, as well as their professor Julian, and the other 5 students are made up of 4 boys and 1 girl, and each of them in their own way is seeking the picturesque and willing to have it played out in their life, no matter what the stakes are. All of these students, especially Henry, their leader, or the sort of head of their group, if you will, is struggling with sort of the mundane and lacklusterness that they are experiencing at this point in their life. And Henry even goes as far as to say at one point that his life has been stale and colorless. Dead, I mean. The world has always been an empty place to me. I was incapable of enjoying even the simplest things. I felt dead in everything I did. And this feeling of deadness and colorlessness in life is what kind of motivates each of these characters in different ways to sort of seek thrills and seek out a more colorful experience of life. But as they learn more of the classics and tend to interpret it in this small sort of echo chamber that they end up in, they kind of decide to leave morals and ethics behind as they go along, and Richard kind of explains how that happened, or maybe not even so much how that happened, but how he's discovered that it has already happened to them. And it's really an interesting and slow reveal how all of this comes to light in the book. This book is also about privilege. Again, Richard at one point says quite late in the book, what was it to them if they had to go an extra term? What did it matter if they failed to graduate, if they had to go back home? At least they had homes to go to. They had trust funds, allowances, dividend checks, doting grandmas, well-connected uncles, and loving families. College for them was only a way station, a sort of youthful diversion. And that is so true for the people that Richard ends up meeting at this Hamden college. And Richard, in a lot of ways, wants this to be true for himself, but he's always kind of faced with the fact that he's a bit on the outside of this group. This is also about friendships and longing and wanting to belong. And I think it's also about how like cults of personality come to take place in people's lives and the impact that cults of personalities can have on an individual person's life or on the life of a group. Finally, I would say this book is about blindness and secrets and secret histories in terms of how not only are histories and our true selves hidden from each other intentionally, but also how we can make ourselves blind to the truth that exists in others and that is right there before our face. So I think for me, that's where I found the title of the book came into play in the story. There were quite a few things that I enjoyed about this book, and I'll share a few of them with you. I thought Donna Tartt did a lot of good things with this book. It was surprisingly quiet, but I did find that it was rather evenly paced, though it was very slow paced. I thought the writing was really well done. I think Donna Tartt has a way with words, and sometimes that way of words can come across as a little unrealistic for her characters. Like, I'm not sure that her college students always spoke as I feel like college students would speak in this setting, but I did appreciate the way she phrased a lot of things. Her writing is always lovely to read, in my opinion, even if the pacing is sometimes really slow. I do feel like overall this book really just kind of pulls you into the setting, into these characters, and into the story, and keeps kind of making you want to come back to it over and over again. And I think some of that happens because of the way Richard tells a story. In speaking of someone else, he very much described how I felt he was telling the story, where he says he was like a propagandist, routinely withholding information, leaking it only when it served his purposes. And I think that so defines how Richard tells this story, where you really are only getting the information he wants you to get when he wants you to get it. And that kind of worked both ways for me. In some ways, I think it kept it a fascinating tale, kept me wanting to know more. And in other ways, it started to feel a little bit unbelievable, especially by the end of the story, where I felt like he was still revealing things that he had talked about way earlier in the book and that he could have revealed to us at other points. But the fact that he was waiting until the end of the story to like finally come out and say some of these things, there were a couple of times where it just kind of felt ridiculous. And like, are you just throwing that in for the shock factor? I don't know. It wasn't unevenly paced. It was just slow the entire time. I also feel like this is a writing habit of Donna Tartt where I feel like she's too descriptive, that there's not enough emphasis placed on some scenes and that she doesn't tend to skip minor details. I feel like you get maximalist writing with her where she just talks about everything at full length for reasons that seem inexplicable to me, I guess. I just can't understand why she does it. And like one perfect example I have of this is there is an epilogue to the story, which basically serves as a denouement. It's telling you what happened to everybody after the main event is over. And when I say it tells you what happens to everybody, I mean literally everybody. Anybody who had a line on the page, you get their after story of like 30 years from now, this is what so-and-so was doing, and this was what so-and-so was doing. It doesn't matter if they were a tertiary character. Even the cat who makes a random appearance towards the end of the book, you hear what happens to the cat later on in its life. Why? Why? Why did we need to know that? The answer is we didn't, but Donna Tartt included it anyway. And those are little things that drive me crazy with her writing because I think it makes her books longer than they need to be. I think this book suffers from when everything is important, nothing becomes important. And I definitely found myself at times struggling to figure out like what was her intent, what was her purpose, what was her message. I feel like I kind of got an idea by the end, but I think it would have been more clear if more things had have been removed from the book. And then my final pet peeve with this book was that the isolation of all of this. The group of students who are in this class with Richard, who become his friend group, are all very isolated from the rest of the university they're attending. And it's a strange thing. I have recognized after having read The Goldfinch and now reading this that Donna Tartt seems to really like to have her characters in isolated settings. She seems to like to have situations where she's only dealing with a handful of characters very intimately. And while I think she does that really well, I think she very much forces aspects of the plot to make her characters be alone. And they end up isolated in ways that like just don't make sense. And like you have to suspend your disbelief in order to keep reading. And that was definitely the case in this. These students are in a class with one teacher who's also all of their counselors, who basically becomes their only teacher that they're going to have for all 4 years of their college education. There's just no point in the university system where I could see that ever happening, even at the most liberal arts college in the 70s. And so that almost took me out of the story because I was just like, this setting would never actually exist. But she made it exist in the story, and she did work it really well for the isolated feel and the helplessness that the students eventually found themselves in. So all that said, how did I like the book? I ended up giving it 3 stars, which even now, I don't know. Like I said at the beginning, like I like thinking about this book and the things that she did in the book, but at the time that I was reading it, I have to be honest, I enjoyed it enough to keep going, but overall, I don't know if I would say I enjoyed reading it. And I really don't know if I'd read it again or if I'd even recommend it to people. I feel like there are other books that I could recommend that would be in isolated settings with good character studies that would just feel better to read. I don't know how to express it other than that. So yeah, it's like a 3 or 3.5 at most for me. And mainly for all the reasons that I said I didn't like it. It really bothered me in the moment of reading it, even though I liked some of the other elements that she did and thought she did them really well. So I think mileage would vary a lot for this book. If you like character studies, this is an excellent book for that. If you don't mind a slow-paced book and you like isolated settings and you like academic settings, you will probably like this book. As far as the dark academia goes, however, if you're expecting a lot of classroom time and class time and interaction and students living on campus, you're not going to get that in this book. I was actually a bit disappointed by that. I thought I was going to get a lot of like in classroom conversation in this small group and a lot of interaction with the teacher, who was a fascinating character in the book, but we got almost none of the teacher from the book. We got almost no information about what they truly learned. We very, very rarely saw them in class. It felt like at times they were the only people on campus, except there were occasionally like they'd run into another student or they'd mention students walking around. But honestly, like in my mind, I pictured this school as being mostly empty, except for the students, the one teacher, and the occasional other student that would like flutter around. It didn't feel like a vibrant campus unless she made the characters go to a party or something like that. At which point I then felt like, well, where did all these people come from? Because they're never around. And yes, she makes up the excuse of how like they're isolated and why they don't see other people, but it was just hard to imagine just the way it was written. So anyway, I'm going back into what I don't like. But if you do like isolated settings or feels, if you like character studies, if you want to see how, if you like to see morally gray characters or characters that are just willing to risk it all to sort of experience something beyond themselves, this would be a good book for that, I guess. You can definitely give it a try. It's just not something that would be at the top of my recommendation list. And honestly, based on a lot of the things I had heard about this book, I feel like maybe it's a bit overhyped. Okay, I feel like I've said enough about this book. Let me move on to the next book whenever I finish that, and I'll come back and talk to you about that one. Okay, book number 2. This is the book that is something new, I guess. This is a book that I purchased in 2026, and it was also published this year, and that work is The Republic of Memory. This is a science fiction space opera, basically, is what it would be considered. And it is about the Safina, the ship Safina, and its crew. This is a generational ship that has left Earth to leave the war, the chaos, the climate, and all of that behind. And the plan is for it to travel for 400 years until it reaches a new home planet where those in cryostasis will be awakened to live and to start afresh. That is the goal. However, one revolt, 200 years, and a lot of discontent and blackouts later, things are not going as planned, and the crew of the Safina has taken over the ship, but at this point, they are looking for reform or a new compact or potentially a revolution to change everything. They are questioning all the things that have been set up by the generations that have come before them, and a whole bunch of factions have been created. Now, this book is told in a really interesting manner. When we start out, we start at the very sort of beginning of the first revolt, where we are introduced initially to the AI Safina that is in charge of running the ship. However, when the AI decides to respond to the Earth's call to come back after they have begun their journey, the crew revolts and decides that they don't want to return to Earth or the network empire that is in charge of it. And they decide to uninstall the AI and continue on the journey on their own. And what follows over the next 200 years is very quickly kind of skimmed over and explained. And the story picks up 200 years into the future, where they are halfway through the journey. They have a new compact, a new government over them, no AI for the ship, and the crew is now the main part of the ship that is running everything. And the ancestors are those who are in cryostasis and are the ones who have sort of planned this whole journey. But as far as the crew is concerned, they're 200 years behind things and just part of the past. A whole bunch of factions have formed, like I said, and they are torn between whether to continue on as planned, to change the plans, to space the ancestors, to keep the ancestors, to awaken the ancestors. I mean, it's lots of people, so lots of different ideas. Speaking of which, the ideas in this book are wide and varied, but it is definitely a space opera in terms of there's lots of different drama going on. This book is full of mystery. There is a lot about the politics and governing of the ship. There are different political factions, though there is one political group called the admin that is in charge, who is really also part of the crew, and they're just supposed to be doing the administration work, but they've become sort of its own form of government that not everybody is completely pleased with, especially as they start to experience trouble with the ship itself, and the ship, it seems to be starting to very quickly fall apart. This is a story about a generation ship, so you do have the original ancestors on the ship, as well as the generations of family members that have come over the course of 200 years, because of course, while the ancestors are sleeping, a crew must stay alive to take care of the ship. So the book does get into all of the issues that could happen on a ship over generations, where the people who initiate the journey may not hold the same ideas as those who are in charge of running the journey over a long period of time, because the crew that is awake is the crew that is having to live and die and exist on this ship generation after generation, and this ship becomes all that they know of life, and that holds its own issues and problems and nostalgia as well. This work is also about survival, both the survival of people as well as ideas over the course of generations. In a lot of ways, it's like the science fiction version of a generational story, though you're starting and looking at mainly just one generation, but you have a lot of reference to past generations because you do have that futuristic aspect of this work. Ultimately, this book is really talking about and looking at what is worth hanging on to. Is the past something you want to bring into the future, and particularly culture and traditions and ancestors themselves? The author of this book, Mahmud El-Sayed, is known for calling his genre that he writes in Arab futurism, and I think that makes a lot of sense. One of the things that I really enjoyed about this book was just the diversity that is involved in the characters, and the point of view not being from sort of your typical white Western point of view in this book. You do have the majority of your characters from a different perspective and a different culture and background. And this is a multi-POV book as well. And the multiple points of view were very diverse. Voices from around the world, well, originally from around the world, but now around the spaceship. They have even changed how people are grouped. You're no longer classified by race or religion, but by language and by the area of the ship that you live in, which has certain types of freedoms and certain drawbacks. And it's really just an interesting and different way of going about thinking about race and culture and religion and diversity. I think the variety of characters that are in this book is really diverse, like I was saying, but I don't feel like it has like diversity representation, where it feels like there's characters from different races and backgrounds in the book just to have characters from different races and backgrounds in the book. It's very intentional in this book. Like, you definitely feel like all of the world in some manner is included on this ship, and that makes it really unique and interesting. I also liked the amount of time that the author spent in this book looking at the different ways the factions had formed and the diversity of viewpoints that there were in regards to the politics in the book. You definitely have references to a lot of the political ideas that currently exist, but you have them in a slightly futuristic form as well. So again, you're getting a little bit of play of things that are familiar to us now, as well as how they might morph and look in the future. And I liked that he wasn't necessarily just pulling out one opinion over the other, but showing how people can have very similar goals, but approach them in different ways in politics and in governing societies. If there was any major drawback in this book, I would just have to say it was the introduction of like the underground language. There is an underground language that is spoken here in the book by some of the characters. And while I thought that was really like great to have in there, it was a bit of a learning curve, because it is a language that is a combination of other languages, which is a really cool idea. But because the characters were speaking it, it was kind of like a very difficult I dialect to read. And you just had to kind of stick with it. It was introduced in one of the earlier chapters, and the entire chapter is written in that dialect. And I was kind of like, oh, this is kind of a lot to work through. But if you stick through that chapter, it does switch after a little while back into just normal printed English, if you will, and that was easier. There is also an odd part of this book that reminded me a bit of like Star Wars in some ways, because I think the language and the dialect that's in here reminded me a lot of one of the Star Wars characters. And so if you don't like that particular character's dialect, you might not like the one in here. But like I said, it's not a huge part of the book, but it does come up throughout. And I think that also actually played really well into some of the themes and stuff in the rest of the book. So I'm not mad about it, but it's just something to know is going to come up, and you're just gonna have to work your way through it. So I have to admit, I was wrong, guys. I apparently do like space operas because this is definitely a space opera with the multiple points of view having to do with sort of, court politics or administration of a sci-fi space civilization. And I liked this book. I gave it 4.5 stars. And yeah, I realized pretty quickly into it that it was definitely going to be very like politics heavy, focused on the revolution, that kind of thing. And I wasn't sure if I was going to like it, but I actually did. So I did at time want a little more focus on the generation ship, but that could come because this is book one in a series, which is the only thing that I am a little bit bummed about. I would read more space operas. I would definitely read more books on generation ships, but I'd prefer to read something that is not part of a series. So if you know of a good space opera that is just a standalone book, or a good book on generation ships that's a standalone, please let me know in the comments below. I would very much appreciate that. In the meantime, I would say this is a book that's good for people who like multi-generational family stories or family sagas. It does have a bit of that feel because I know not everybody who watches my channel likes science fiction, but if you like books about multi-generational families or about politics, you should probably try this book because you probably will like that. It's not super heavy on like how all the science is working and how the spaceship is operating and that kind of thing. So if you don't like science fiction or think you don't like it because you get hung up on all the scientific terms and that kind of stuff, there's not a huge amount of that going on here. The focus really is on the civilization and the politics and the ongoing mystery about why they're having all these blackouts and why there's all these issues going on with the electricity. Because of course, in a space opera, you're going to have a mystery and there's going to potentially be some sabotage and conspiracies going on in the background. And you definitely get a lot of that in this book as well. This is also a great book for anybody who's looking for more diverse reads, if that's something that you're interested in, or if you just want to read more books that are from a like white Western perspective, this would be a really good book for that. I feel like I was introduced to a lot of different cultures and different religious ideas and ways of thinking about things than I typically find in your standard science fiction novel. And so that was really nice to experience as well. And according to my husband, he actually thinks that this book is very similar to The Expanse, like Leviathan Wakes, that kind of thing. He is now on book 4 in that, and just my talking to him about this book reminded him of his reading experience with that, which may just be because they're both space operas, but I don't know, maybe there's more similarities than I know because I have not read that. So that is the second book, and let's move on to book number 3. All right, I'm back to talk to you about Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl by Harriet Jacobs. This was first published in 1861, and the edition that I have is put out by Barnes & Noble's Classics. This is a nonfiction memoir, and this is the book that I am using for Something Borrowed, apparently, going with my wedding theme that just came out of nowhere. This is just how it ended up working together. But I have to say, having done this was actually kind of a fun way to put together a little reading list, so give it a try sometime. Let me know what your something old, something new, and something borrowed and something blue was. I also realized that the background of this book is blue, so I don't need to use my scarf for that. Anyway, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. Let me tell you what this is about. This book is about Harriet Jacobs, the author of the book. It is her memoir, and she was born into slavery in 1813. This is the account of her life as an enslaved girl, her escape from slavery, the flight or path that she took to come out of slavery, the years that she spent in hiding, which is just absolutely horrific, and how she gained her freedom. And it was a long time coming. That was probably one of the things about the book that really surprised me, especially once she escaped the plantation that she grew up on. I thought her freedom was going to come much more quickly, and I learned a lot. This book is told in the voice of Harriet Jacobs. She originally published this, however, under a pseudonym for a variety of different reasons, clearly. And in it, she makes direct pleas and protest against the slave conditions, the Fugitive Slave Act, and everything related to that. In a lot of ways, even some of the things that she said remind me of Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, and it makes sense. They shared a lot of the same ideas. This book in its entirety, which is not very long, covers her life as well as the conditions on the plantation and the lives of those around her, that both people she knew as well as people she did not know, and some of her life even as she escapes and lives eventually as a freed person. And she definitely gets into a multiple number of circumstances and backgrounds of people, so you're really not going to hear just about her life as an enslaved girl, but also the conditions in general, as well as specific stories that she knew of or heard of. I did listen to this entire audiobook, so that's how it is borrowed, even though I clearly own the book. I thought there were a lot of really compelling arguments that she made in this book. I think it was strengthened by the fact that she was able to talk about it in a first-person experience. She shares a lot of the brutal acts that happened to enslaved people, and this sense of how, they're never safe and what that does to them as a person and as people. And one of the things that I really appreciated about her accounts is that they weren't accounts that were shared just for the dramatic effect or just for the trauma. For each account she shared, she really did share what her purpose was of the accounts. I also really liked the way the book was structured. Each of the chapters kind of gives you an idea of what she's going to talk about, and I think that makes it really easy to go back and reference this book. The titles are, the chapter titles are things like Childhood, The Jealous Mistress, What Slaves Are Taught to Think of the North, Sketches of Neighboring Slaveholders. So it's pretty clear what you're going to get in each chapter. And again, I think that's helpful because this is a book that I feel like you'd want to be able to go back and reference specific passages from. I thought this whole book was really well paced. For what it was. Like, I didn't feel like there was part of her story where I lost interest or where I wasn't interested in coming back. I mean, I feel like that's a really harsh thing to say about memoirs, but sometimes that happens. I don't feel like there was any extraneous information in this, which I think is the main point. It was really clear the writing was really well done. I really liked her narrative voice, and the audiobook was really good because of that. I liked the woman who narrated the audiobook I listened to. I will put that up on the screen, and I thought she did a really good job. It made it feel very personal, and again, it was a direct narration the entire time, so I did feel like she was speaking to and addressing me as well as like a community of people in the US, which at the time she was. This is a book that I don't feel like really needs to be rated. In general, I don't like rating memoirs because if they're poorly edited, I feel like that's an editor-publisher issue that should have been corrected, and typically they're not badly edited, and then at that point I feel like, can I really rate someone's personal life experience? So I gave it a rating of 5 on the story graph just so that it would have a rating, but overall I would just say that beyond rating, this is a really good narrative and a really good memoir. I tend to like memoirs as far as nonfiction goes, but I definitely got burnt out on them at one point, but that was not the situation here. I really would have physically sat down or read this book or listened to it on audiobook, and I can definitely see myself reading it again. I think this is a great book for anyone who wants to learn more about the slave experience or experience of life on a plantation, especially under what someone could call a good or kind or Christian master, because she talks about her experience of that as well as other people's experience of that and why she would still rather be free, which is something that not everyone believes anymore for some reason. I would also say if you're looking for a good protest novel, or if you're looking for arguments for some reason, because again, some people seem to think that slavery was not that bad or we don't need to think about it, she will give you all the reasons as to why we still need to think about this. Also, I appreciated the fact that it wasn't overly sentimental. That was maybe a critique that you could have of Uncle Tom's Cabin, even though that was intentionally written partially as a sentimental novel. This is not. This is very straightforward, practical. She's not really trying to pull on your heartstrings. She's really just calling people to live up to the things that they say are important to them and not be hypocritical in how they live their lives. I also think this is a great book if you like first-person accounts of anything. She does a really good job of narrating her own personal story and all the hardships and what it was like to be a slave girl, as she puts it. So this is a book that I would highly recommend, and overall I think I had a really good reading time. As a reminder, because I feel like, at least for me, it's been a while, I read The Secret History The Republic of Memory, An Instance in the Life of a Slave Girl. Let me know if you've read any of these books, what you thought of them, and yeah, let's talk in the comments below. That's it for today. I hope you had a great reading week, and I will talk to you next time. Bye. I also feel like you guys are like really high up and I'm like looking to the sky, but that's my fault and we'll just deal with it for now. Maybe next time I'll also like lower you down a little bit, like, hey.